Hi, this is Pastor Josh from First Baptist of Queen. Thank you for joining us on our Wednesday night's walkthrough, verse-by-verse walkthrough of the entire Old Testament. Tonight we're going to continue as we look at David and Saul's interaction outside the cave at En-Gedi. So let's look at verse 12 of 1 Samuel chapter 24. May the Lord judge, this is David speaking to Saul. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancient says, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea? May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it, and plead my cause, and deliver me from your hand. Now, in the Hebrew, this section of David's speech takes on some very unique qualities. His sentence, particularly there in verse 14, are synonymously parallel couplets. It would seem that David, the psalmist, cannot help but convert his words into poetry as he gets going. Even in the next verse, he uses 5 different clauses to essentially say the same thing using very colorful language. He says that the Lord be judge, the Lord give sentence, the Lord see to it, the Lord plead my cause, the Lord deliver me. When David it's flowing with his words, it would seem that he cannot help but slip into his poetic giftedness that makes his psalms so memorable. And then back up in verse 13, David tells Saul that no matter how ruthlessly he pursues after him, that he, David, will do nothing that might potentially harm him. This is quite the confession to be telling a man who has sworn to come and kill you. David seems to essentially be telling Saul that even if he does someday catch up to him, that he will not fight back and risk striking him. David seems to want to remind Saul from where he has come and upon whom he should be relying. David is going to trust the Lord no matter what Saul might do in his efforts to overtake David. David tells Saul that ultimately the Lord will be the one who will handle the situation and see his will fulfilled. Verse 16. As soon as David had finished saying these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me in your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day." So now Saul seems to wake up and revert back to who he had been before the jealousy took over his entire personality. It's possible that Saul, he's far enough physically away from the cave that he could hear David's voice but not be able to recognize his face. Now, as a side note, this is the single longest continuous quote from Saul in all of the Bible. So he calls back a realization about David's identity and a confession about his own sinful actions. This is quite the remarkable shift for Saul, who had just been maniacally hunting David down. He seems to be making perfect sense now and to have his logical reasoning restored. But why do you think he reverted back to his former compassion and caring and kindness for David? Maybe it was the vulnerability of David standing before him. Maybe it was the realization that David could very well have killed him and that he chose rather to spare his life. That might have been enough to shake the stain of bitter jealousy out of his eyes so that he could remember who David was. And Saul recognizes David's faithfulness and righteousness and even his own personal unrighteousness, whereas there had been times previously when Saul had credited the Lord with circumstances that defied the Lord's plans. But this time, Saul confesses to his intended enemy that he has been wrong and has sinned greatly in chasing him down. Then Saul goes so far as to do the unthinkable. He prays a blessing over his enemy David, which he follows with an even more outrageous prophecy. Verse 20. So here's the prophecy. "And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me therefore by the Lord that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house." And David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home But David and his men went up to the stronghold. So Saul says that he knows with certainty that David will one day be the king in his place. And this implication is rather that David will be king rather than Saul's son Jonathan. He even says that the nation will be established under David's reign. That means that Saul is prophesying that the kingdom will abundantly prosper with David as king. This would undoubtedly have been something that Saul would have wanted to happen under his own rule, but he prophesies that David will be the one to lead into such flourishing. And in the same manner as did Jonathan when he understood that David would be king, Saul wants David to swear that he will not destroy every one of the descendants, his own descendants, after he is gone. So David consents to not wipe out the entire line of Saul, and he does eventually live up to this promise, though it does take a number of years for David to remember that promise. Then Saul returns to his palace in Gibeah, but David remains out there in the middle of nowhere. He's holed up in a stronghold. David does not also return to Gibeah, as does Saul. He doesn't return to his wife, possibly because he does not fully trust Saul's moment of clarity, that it will remain. Saul's prophecy stands out glaringly against the backdrop of his most recent actions and decrees. It's possible that Saul's initial gifting of the Spirit when he came on him was directly related to prophecy, for Saul prophesied previously in both 1 Samuel 10:10 and 1 Samuel 19:24. And when the afflicting spirit came on Saul in 1 Samuel 18:10, the language used to describe Saul's response is very similar to what happened when someone prophesied. So maybe Saul's realization invoked a revelation that evoked an old, long neglected spiritual gift. He prophesied David's rise and the kingdom's rise, and then he applies the prophecy to his own life by asking David to care for his family. When we similarly are confronted with the word of the Lord, as was Saul here out of his own mouth, we should immediately act to apply it to our lives, as did Saul. He spoke the word of the Lord, and then he applied it by asking David to care for his family when he becomes king. 1 Samuel 25, verse 1. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. Then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran, and there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife, Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. Samuel, the last Israelite judge, the nationally respected prophet, he died. And so we're told, it's quite a statement that is most likely hyperbolic, but still just as widespread. It says, all of Israel gathered together. And they gathered together for a time of national grief, a time of national mourning. This could mean that the people loyal to David and the people loyal to Saul and all the people not taking sides gather together for this great big funeral. Most likely, though, it's hyperbole. It doesn't seem likely that Saul and David both come together for a momentary ceasefire following their encounter at En-Gedi for this national tragedy. They could have, but probably not. Saul's death could have been a circumstance or Samuel's death could have been a circumstance that superseded other momentary problems and grievances. But the people gather in large quantity to mourn Samuel, and then his body is taken wherever it had been. It's taken back to his home in Ramah. Now, it's interesting that we're not told where he died. We're not told exactly how he died. I mean, had he been in the wilderness? Had he been in the capital city of Gibeah? Had he been near David and his men? And if it were not in a populated area, did he have a servant with him to help notify people who would need to know of the death of someone so significant in the life of the nation? But as is always the case with Scripture, we're not told, or when we're not told, it's because we do not need to know for God's purposes for this portion of Scripture. So after Samuel's death, David continues off and goes down to the wilderness of Paran, which was also, interestingly enough, traveled by the Israelites when they were in the wilderness back in Numbers chapter 10. Maybe David used Samuel's death and national mourning and all the attention on him as an opportunity to escape further south. And so he goes down here to the region of Maon. And this region of Maon was 7 miles south of Hebron, about 15 or so miles from where David had been with his men at En-Gedi. There's also, actually, this place still exists with this name today. And then Carmel was a local village not too far away where Nabal could travel the short distance for trade and work. This man had developed an incredible amount of wealth through his ever-growing sheep and goat business. And quite possibly Nabal may not have been his actual name because it literally means foolish, senseless, especially of a man who has no perception of ethical or religious claims. It's the idea of being ignoble or disgraceful. I kind of have a hard time imagining his parents, when he's born, taking great pride to name their baby boy Foolish, especially before he had any opportunity to do anything foolish. So he may be a nickname that people in the area had given him. He had developed into a fool, so they named him Fool, Nabal. Though greatly considered foolish and wicked, Nabal was, as we're told here, a member of a very prominent family. He was a descendant of Caleb, who had been with Joshua to spy out the land after leaving Egypt. Caleb had gone into the mountainous regions of Hebron, defeated the giants who lived there when he was 85 years old. It had been Caleb's family who had eventually founded David's birth city, Bethlehem. And just as much as he was foolish and evil, his wife was exceedingly wise and beautiful. Her name, Abigail, means my father was delighted. So her name implies bringing great joy to her father. So whereas Nabal's name implies wide renown as a fool in behavior and attitude, then we again get what happens throughout the entire book of 1 Samuel. We get a story of contrasts. As the book of 1 Samuel has contrasted Samuel and Eli, contrasted David and Saul. Here we get the contrast of Nabal and his wife. Nabal's foolish wickedness and Abigail's wise beauty. Verse 4. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men. And David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel, and go to Nabal and greet him in my name, and thus you shall greet him. Peace be to you, and peace to your house, and peace be to all that you have." So both being from Judah and David being from Bethlehem, David may have known Nabal, or at least known of him. And he receives a report possibly from one of his spies, as many spies that he has. As he's had some who've reported to him the whereabouts of Saul in the past, they now report to him about Nabal. And this report lets him know that good old Nabal is up at Carmel doing his twice yearly chore of shearing all of his 3,000 sheep. So David commissions 10 of his men to go up to Nabal and petition him for some help and some supplies. Again, maybe there was some kind of family connection between the two of them, or maybe there was some kind of relational connection that had led David to believe that Nabal would have been favorable to him. Or maybe David simply was relying on the common sense kindness of this wealthy man to whom David had shown kindness, as he describes in verses to come. Whatever it was, there was something between the two of them that had led David to believe he could ask Nabal for help and he would come to do so. David wants to make sure that his men invoke his own name when greeting Nabal, which again makes us think that Nabal knew of David. Then they are to give a three-statement blessing to Nabal on himself, on his entire household, and on all of his possessions. And notice that they are supposed to state the word peace 3 times. It's probably very strategic. The word peace, this is the Hebrew word shalom. And during the time of Jesus, the word shalom came to mean perfect peace when it was used twice. But here in the Old Testament, 1,000 years prior to Jesus, saying shalom 3 times takes on the biblical usage of the number 3, the number, one of the numbers of perfection, completion. So saying shalom 3 times would be taken to mean bestowing perfect peace on the recipient of the words, Nabal. And if David really did know Nabal, he would have known all about Nabal's character. And that would have demonstrated much, again, about David's character, to bless somebody like Nabal with perfect peace. And so after this peaceful greeting, the messengers are supposed to continue with a description and a request of Nabal. Verse 7. "I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." So David and his men had apparently done the honorable thing and not the seemingly typical thing of the day, simply by the fact that David points out that his men did not harm Nabal's shepherds, nor did they help themselves to any of his 3,000 sheep. That lets us know that such activities seem to have been the expected behavior of the day. It also implies a level of protection provided by David and his men for the shepherds. Nothing went missing. That means that not only did David take nothing, but he also prevented anyone else from taking anything from them. And so accordingly, David asks Nabal to provide some provisions for he and his men, since they had taken such good care of Nabal's men and his sheep. By also referring to his own men as Nabal's servants and himself as Nabal's son, David is placing both himself and his men humbly under Nabal. David also says that they are coming to ask for provision during a time of feasting. Firstly, this could mean that there would be an abundance of food throughout the area so that providing for David and his men would not be too much of a hardship. In addition, the abundant food of the feast would also be an easier time to disguise sending food to a fugitive like David. It would have been so easy and made so much sense and been a grateful gesture of generosity on Nabal's part to help out David and his men. But Nabal is none of those things. Verse 9. When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and they waited. Nabal made them wait. And Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their master. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed from my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" Notice that mentioning that they waited to hear an answer from Nabal is a way for the author to emphasize that Nabal was content to allow these men to simply just stand there and wait. He didn't feel any need to be in any kind of hurry to respond to David because he didn't think very much of David. It would actually appear that Nabal didn't think very much of anyone except maybe himself. And though David's men could have mentioned David's father in their initial greeting, and that may not have been included in this passage, but it is also just as likely that the men didn't mention David's father, and rather Nabal knew exactly who David was and from what family he came. He then proceeded to insult David and his men by revealing his true political thoughts on the matter. He refers to David and his men simply as slaves who have rebelled against and escaped from their owner, Saul. He seems to see them all as merely lawbreakers with whom he would find that if he associated himself with them, he would be against Saul. So Nabal wants nothing to do with David, seemingly out of a dedicated loyalty to Saul. But rather, Nabal doesn't seem to view David nor his men as worth helping at all. He also thinks very highly of himself. Notice the 4 instances of the personal pronoun there in reference to his own ability and his own supplies. He believes that all he has acquired is the result of his own hard work and ingenuity rather than the Lord's provision. Besides the fact that he already may have revealed that he knows David, at the end of the passage, he says that he doesn't want to help those with David because he doesn't know anything about them. Nabal doesn't want to use anything that he considers profits from his own efforts to help someone else. And that doesn't sit too well with good old David. Verse 12. So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. And David said to his men, "Every man strap on his sword." And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. So David's messengers, they may have been struck. They may have been in shock and in indignation at such a complete rejection of their leader David's request with this level of insult. So they make it all the way back to David's camp and give him a full report of the entire conversation. And now, having seen David's continued faithfulness thus far, we now see him react immediately rather than seek the Lord for direction. It would seem that David's emotions run hot, and his response to so intense an insult against he and his men is to grab some weapons and head out to battle. If David had slowed down and inquired of the Lord, the situation might have played out a little differently and in the Lord's way and in the Lord's timing. But as it is, David, at least for the moment, reacts in a manner similar to how King Saul reacted when feeling offended. They have decided on actions based on how they feel in the moment instead of making decisions based on the Lord's work. And all of David's 600 men pick up their swords preparing for battle. And a point is made specifically that David attaches his own sword. And do you remember the last time David acquired a sword? Which sword that was? David is most likely still carrying around Goliath's sword as they have been traveling from place to place. And he heads out towards Nabal's place with 400 of his men, leaving another 200 behind. And the baggage here that those 200 stay with, it was probably more than simply suitcases. This is any and all of their supplies and possibly even their own families that they leave behind. So the job of the remaining 200 is quite important so that none of the supplies will be taken while the larger force moves against their enemies. And it's important for a decree that David will issue later on concerning how the men will guard the supplies or who guard the supplies, how they are treated in the future. Now, thank you for joining us as we go verse by verse through the Old Testament. I hope you'll join us next time as we keep walking through the Old Testament. And we're going to see what happens when Nabal's wife finds out what her husband has done.